You know what David Bowie said? Hitler was the first rock star.
Okay, well, broken clock is right twice a day.
He actually, that whole Ziggy Stardust, Thin White Duke era, he was obsessed with fascism, back then. Like I would actually throw Romans like from the back of his convertible limousines and stuff at people as he was like coming in through the airport and stuff. Like,
Which is so funny because even later on, people might call this like a hyper real sort of thing. But Marilyn Manson, who was himself obsessed with David Bowie, kind of went through an album cycle for the golden age of grotesque. Like all of a sudden, he was dressing in this sort of modern German. He was in these huge stretch Rolls Royce limos. It was like an old Art Deco Nazi aesthetic he was going to, and what he was doing was copying David Bowie. But like we're at a place where you're just, I think, going through a Nazi period is just baked in the cake if you want to be a rock star.
well, the whole his Ziggy Stardust phase, the whole red and white and blue lightning bolt was based on the British Union Fascist logo.
So what was his relationship with that? So was this all just aesthetics to Bowie, or do you think it might have?
Essentially,
I don't know
it's
anything
all
about this.
art. I think it was all art play with him, honestly. Plus he was zapped out of his mind on cocaine, like for that portion of the 70s, right? I mean, a mountain of cocaine.
Man, you mean good idea powder? That's why.
Yeah, booger sugar.
Yeah, I should introduce you first because we're going on a tear now, and I like this. Some of the other people I have on the show, I came to them through listening to their content, but I know you just as a guy. We've known each other, thinking of it now online as much as you can know someone online. I think you can know them very well for a few years now, actually.
Yeah, it's been a few years for sure.
And we have to really set this in stone right now. I need to know how to pronounce your name because I know you as Eald. Is that
Well,
right?
it was Eald Graegwulf, but that was my Twitter handle, and people have married me to that name. But on Telegram and certain other places, I go by Negative Bodhi Image. So a lot of people just call me Bodhi now, but it's up to you, whatever you want to call me. I mean, I personally, I'm not married to either.
I like Bodhi because I can pronounce it because I'm like Eald. And then I
Yeah,
know at consistent points in this whole talk, I'm going to sound retarded.
and
But
it sounds retarded, anyways. Yald, right? Yald.
well, then we have a lot of Europeans, we have a lot of continentals who listen to the show. So they're going to be listening to that saying, finally, someone speaking my language. Enough of this Canadian calling people after stuff.
And this is our segue into the Finnish topic, the FQ, if you will.
Every time I go into my chat, there's a debate about Finnish people, and I don't know how it starts and I don't know how it ends, but it's always happening.
Yeah, whether they're white or not. If the reason I jumped out of Joel's chat was because every morning I would wake up to 1,000 messages of are Albanians white, are Finnish people white. It's like I can't handle the endless debate any longer.
It's like, do we have a win state for this? Like, can we devise a way just to tell if someone is white? Because we've been doing the Finnish white thing for years, and it's longer than the atheism versus Christianity thing at this point.
Yeah, well, I've always said Europeans because I find that's more useful, and you can demarcate it a little bit better, not perfectly, but a little bit better. And I definitely draw a distinction between Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans, between Meds and Nords or Germanics.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And so would they. And everyone kind of instinctively gets that. And then even within the Slav, they would have their own debates. But to everyone else, like, oh no, I get that you're Slavs, and we're done. And I think Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, he just goes Euro Canadians. If you're European and you're Canadian, you're a Euro Canadian.
Well,
And I say, okay.
under the Canadian Charter of human rights or whatever, or our charter, you can actually advocate for European Canadians under the charter. The language draws a distinction for being pro-European diaspora positive talk. But as soon as you label it white, then it becomes something that's on the 6 o'clock news.
Yeah, and that's true. And I like Euro Canadians because it sounds like something regular people can understand. And, I've got nothing against people in our broad scene who, like, No White Guilt is one guy, and he came up with this new concept called biospirit. And I'm like, this is all getting very esoteric to people. You got to teach them a whole bunch of new terms. If you say Euro Canadian, everyone kind of knows what you mean. So let's go with that.
Esoteric coneyism.
And just because he looks like David Duke's son, he thinks he can walk around making up all new kinds of fucking words.
Well, the way I look at it is everybody west of the Slavic regions is comprised of 3 basic genetic grouping. The Western hunter-gatherers, early European farmers, and Indo-Europeans. Whereas over in the Eastern European sphere, they're comprised of Eastern hunter-gatherers, some Denisovan admixture, and even the Eastern Neanderthals that populated that area were a distinct, genetically distinct from Western Neanderthals. So yeah, I think that's an easy distinction to make between European peoples.
And then you got whatever Bjork is, Icelandic. Like, when people say Asiatic, that's a general term. I'm like, oh, you mean like Bjork? Like if like Hapa, but they've been here for 20,000 years. I get that.
That's a meeting of Mongolian and Nordic, sort of, isn't it? The Sami and all that.
There's probably a story there. There's probably a big story of like, oh, and it goes back to the Vikings, and it goes back to one boat of Polynesians that got lost, and then they met a dragon. It all gets very whimsical if you go back far enough. That's why I love it. It's going to be giants involved. Once you know a mythology's real history when they start talking about giants. I'm just going to leave that on the table for people.
Speaking of Scandinavian eccentrics, I think that's a good segue into Pentti Linkola.
It is.
We're supposed to be talking about.
We are supposed to be talking about because my friend here is, I would call you an eco-fascist, but even that term, I think, has not a lot of credit, even for people who would be called that. It's kind of what other people would refer to you as. I know Linkola, who we're going to talk about, I know he does not like the term. He would call himself deep ecologist. And just before we continue, I will mention to people the reason we bring this up because on our show we had covered a book by Linkola called "Can Life Prevail?" Released by what was it, Arctos, I believe it was. So there's a clip of that for people who want maybe some starting material, but we're going to talk a bit more about him on this. But just to the point I was just making, we can continue now. So about ecofascism and deep ecology, I think you had something to say.
Well, just that neither Kaczynski or Linkola were pro-fascist in the political sense. Like Kaczynski said he thought fascism was stupid, and he also said that he thought Hitler was evil and National Socialism was an evil ideology. So he was definitely not on the whole third positionist scale. And Linkola, he drew comparisons between the Holocaust and ecocide, ecological destruction that's going on, and he said that they should be talked about in the same breath. So you can take from that whatever connotations you want, but it doesn't overlap fascist political ideology that much. It's just the harsh conclusions that they reach are so jarring to most people that they don't know where to categorize it. So they lump it in with the colloquial idea of fascism, which is anything that opposes the liberal order. And make no mistake, Linkola was pro-authoritarian. He wanted to institute a sort of green authoritative dictatorship, where they would have green police that would essentially ensure that the people were properly motivated to foster their local ecology. So he wasn't averse to authoritarianism.
Well, that's what I liked about Linkola, and even if I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, because I wouldn't say that I'm that extreme about it, but I guess therein lies the point that his prescriptions, what he says we must do to accomplish the world he wants, are extreme by necessity. And so when I look at other environmentalist groups, when I even look at something like Extinction Rebellion or the Greta Thunbergs of the world, I say they will look at Linkola like he's extreme, he's an eco-fascist. But I say, well, no, he's the only one who's thought about this all the way to the bottom. So if you are an environmentalist and you are taking it seriously, you have to be like this guy, wouldn't you? Because he's the one who's actually thought, like, what would it take for us to really live in balance with nature? And it's going to be, you're going to take some big fucking swings to accomplish that. And you're going to need probably some, maybe 50 to 100 year period of some real shit going down, to put it lightly.
Well, the difference between a deep ecologist like Pentti Linkola and a green rebellion, or extinction rebellion green radical, is that one views things from an anthropomorphic lens. When you look at the deep ecology sphere as a whole, it's filled with people who are advocating things like social justice and climate justice for impoverished nations and reparations and all these other things that really are they're sort of they're not really related to a true ecological vision. And I think Pentti Linkola was entirely focused on an ecological vision going forward, because he wasn't a nationalist per se, but his views on immigration get him lumped in with the furthest right anti-immigration sentiment you can imagine, right? But his perspective was that more people is necessarily equates to more environmental impact, and he was against that.
Exactly. So if you are a deep ecologist, if you are an environmentalist and you're serious about limiting air travel, vehicles, everything, you are going to, it follows that you would create a world without cars and airplanes. So how could people go except for perhaps how they used to with ships? But then most people didn't go on those. That wasn't the era of mass travel. And so I guess that's why I like it, because he thought about it all the way to the bottom, because he's thinking like, okay, to live in a balance with nature, it's not even that you're anti-immigration in the way that the average person today would think of it. It's like, no, you want a world where immigration wouldn't make sense. No one would need to go anywhere. Why would they? Or they couldn't. It wouldn't make sense to just walk to a place for resources, walk 3 years to get across the world.
He advocated destruction of any machine that would do a person's work for them. So he was pretty extreme on the technological front as well. Like, he wasn't one of these people who think that all we have to do is switch to cobalt or like lithium ion batteries and everything's going to be solved. Because he understands that uh, the fossil fuel jackpot that we hit in the last 120 or 150 years has been the biggest boon for humans in terms of free power that we've ever discovered, ever in the human history. Better than slavery, because for every unit of energy you put into extracting fossil fuels, you get 100 units of energy back. And no battery technology that we've come up with can even approach that number. Not
Right.
even close. So in order for their vision to be realized, they're going to have to extract massive amounts of minerals and elements that we're running out of. Like cobalt, especially, is one that's very scarce, and relies upon slave labor to harvest, mainly in Africa and things. And most of the world's rare earth minerals are in the domain of Asian countries. China has mountains of it, and also Japan, who is our ally at the moment. But as we've seen, any student of history knows that upheaval in the world can quickly shift alliances.
And I remember when we had covered Can Life Prevail on the show, he gets very detailed, like you had said, in the type of world that he wants and how it would function, which is what I found impressive. And it seemed that it does almost get into a philosophical, overview of how humans ought to behave. And so, like you had said, it's like he's against any machine that makes work easier, but it also, in a lot of ways, and this is what I got from him describing it, was he wants to limit the amount of impact, for certainly the disproportionate impact, but also any impact that humans could have on the environment, to the point of, like, he was about conserving old growth forests. We don't want to terraform. We don't want to alter the terrain at all. Even, does that sound accurate?
Yeah, he actually started an institute that bought acreages of some of the most ecologically compromised areas of southern Finland for preservation, and with the stipulation that there's no human imprint upon them. And in preparation for the show, I was just trying to refresh, a lot of his ideas and stuff. I was listening to some podcasts people did of him, and there was this one called the Log House, and they were thinking to themselves, why wouldn't it be okay to go in and take blow down trees and stuff for firewood and stuff, because essentially that's that's a wood that would otherwise go to waste in their mind. But actually, that provides nutrients and a lot of other key functions in a forest ecosystem, like taking out scrub wood that falls down for because of fire hazards in a tree lot, or removing like dead standing. That actually negatively impacts the forest life cycle, because as that wood decomposes, it turns into sort of a sponge that moisture uh, resides in through long periods of drought. Like, if you've ever seen, you've gone walking in the forest and seen like a really rotted tree, it's more or less like, I don't know what the texture is like. It's like mashed potatoes almost,
Yeah, yeah.
and that is the function of a dead tree in the forest, is to hold moisture and become a substrate for mycelium, which is also important to the root networks of trees, living trees.
Oh yeah, the root networks. I think, just as a tangent, I recommended a movie to you a while ago called In the Earth, because anytime I would see something ecology related, I would just send it this guy's way. I'm like, it's about trees. I bet you'll like that.
I didn't actually see it, but I do remember you telling me that now.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
basically, it's a story about, like what you're saying, like almost like a fungal network beneath that's connecting. It takes place in this. It's in England, modern day, and this guy's hypothesizing that there's actually this sort of mushroom fungus network across most of the continent, and that it's got some kind of intelligence to it. Sorry, I cut you off there.
no, that's okay, and that's actually not far off. I think that it they've done these studies recently, where they've discovered that um, trees can actually share nutrients along different mycorrhizal pathways, and through root networks attached to them. So, because they would put these super rare elements in one area of a forest, and then test for this rare element in other trees in this little patch of forest, and they found that it was actually distributed among the trees in that area. So this is brand new research, but it has huge implications, about the complicated nature of things that we take for granted.
Well, what's interesting is, over the past couple months, we've been discussing artificial intelligence and going deep into these various books. And one of the things that strikes you when you learn about artificial intelligence is how intelligence is actually defined and how it's built with our neural networks and stuff. And when people try and build AI, they can replicate most of how a brain works, not how a mind works, but at least a brain. Anyway, the reason I say that is because they're like, people say, "Oh, well, plants can't think." I'm like, "Well, what is thinking?" Right? A lot of the times, like what we call thinking is just having the right kind of sensors, the right sort of feedback loops that we can tell when something is failed or succeeded, and memory. So if you've got sensors, feedback, and memory, that is, you can look at time lapse videos of plants, like, and how they grow and how they seek things out. Well, they do memory, they do hold some kind of genetic memory at some level, nothing like consciousness, or maybe on a large enough scale. That's what that book, the movie, was about, In the Earth. But it's like, once you break down the components of how you define intelligence, well, trees can have some level of, at least memory and approximating desire in a way. Now that sounds very esoteric to people, but I like my mind wanders into that area sometimes.
Well, that's one of the things that I try and relay to people as like, um, I grew up as a Catholic, and I grew up in a really sort of smallish rural town and stuff. And one of the things that dawned on me as I was growing up is the anthropocentric nature of humans, and I didn't really quite understand it. I didn't understand how people could look at things as just simple commodities and units of production and things in nature, like like, or potential for some sort of consumer product. Um, that's one of the things that Pentti Linkola was. He tried to look at it from a strictly objective perspective, because which is hard to do in anywhere that has an Abrahamic religion as its foundation, because one of the tenets of the Abrahamic religions is that God created Earth for man, and he gave man dominion over the earth, right? And that can be, depending on your cultural and mores and stuff, that can be interpreted a lot of different ways, and is.
That is true. And whenever I've read, books in the past, we've covered this, it always seems to have an adversarial relationship with nature, especially for people who aren't even Christian, but or a subscriber to any Abrahamic faith, but still they like to pretend they're Roman, and they pretend they're like a Viking warrior, and they're the Faustian man. It's like, I'm here just to conquer the world, conquer nature, conquer the unknown. And so
Conquer
there's a
the
lot of
stars.
that. Yeah, exactly. But then and I'm guilty of that as anyone. I like a lot of this stuff, but like one of the reasons I'm attracted to so many scenes on the right is, this will come with some baggage, but the whole idea of blood and soil and stuff. And it seems to be that only our area of the political world seems to recognize the sanctity and importance of the land and of nature, and have a deeper connection with that than any leftist liberal, as much as they talk about it, more than any of them have ever had, in my opinion.
Well, what I would say to people who say, let's conquer the stars, or let's conquer, a continent or whatever, it's like, conquer yourself and I'll be impressed. You know, a lot of people, they impose deficiencies outwardly. So if they have an insecurity, they'll project it. If they have, some sort of, and a lot of people in the dissident right are guilty of this. So if they are some sort of like social outsider, they have some sort of maladaptive trait, they push it outwardly, But conquering yourself is one of the hardest things to do. And the thing that's so admirable about Pentti Linkola is, of all the environmental writers and all the environmental thinkers, he's a man who actually lived his truth. He lived in a cabin without electricity or running water. He didn't have a radio, a TV, computer, a phone up until the last few months of his life when his health was in jeopardy. He he commuted to work on either a bicycle or a horse. He rowed a boat out to fish by hand and sold his wares in a horse-drawn cart. Now, he didn't do that because he was LARPing,
Yeah.
as you know what I mean. He was doing that because that was his truth, and that's what he sought. He thought would be a sustainable model, or at least the least impactful model that he could impose upon the world. And you compare and contrast that with somebody like David Suzuki, who has like uh, multiple several thousand square foot homes and two private jets, and there's really no comparison. Who would you listen to? Who do you think is more authentic? Who do you think is more committed to the bit?
I was about to say, I don't know how much you might have saved up on this topic, but if you wanted to take a detour into hating David Suzuki, I would be willing to go with you down that path. Because in my life, I've known a couple environmentally conscious people growing up, people's parents who are really into these sorts of causes, and the same refrain I'd heard all the time was, "Yeah, but fuck David Suzuki." Do you have any
Yeah,
insider
really.
knowledge on this guy? Because I just don't like him.
All you have to do is like, this guy's supposed to be a scientist, and I remember watching the footage of his debate with Philippe Rushton on human intelligence and the human difference. Basically, Philippe Rushton was a intelligence researcher, and he was a race realist, basically. And the entire debate was Philippe Rushton lobbing out um, studies and facts and academic insights and all David Suzuki could muster were ad hominems and feel good sort of platitudes and things. And at the end of the debate, David Suzuki got a standing ovation, and Philippe Rushton basically booed off the stage, right? Ushered out by police escort. I forget which university it was, maybe Queens or something, Queens University, and it was an absolute farce. But it was that's all I really needed to know about David Suzuki. Is like he couldn't even argue for global homo with scientific data.
He's like a Bill Nye the Science Guy type, where people have just said, "Oh, this is Mister Science." He's the
Yeah,
science. He's the science. Of course, he's the guy who knows everything about environmentalism, and it seems to be that him just showing up is enough to tilt any issue. He's just this political chess piece. But I'm like, the word on the street on this guy is no one fucking likes this guy, but he's still there. And he's in the rarefied air of this entire nation of Canada. You can't touch this guy. It's the damnedest thing.
I have more respect for Neil deGrasse Tyson, honestly. That's saying something.
I'm just looking at his Wikipedia right now. What a weird, like, he's got some strange books here. He's trying to like predict the future now too, and I think he's getting into that truth and reconciliation stuff. I think maybe people think he's Aboriginal. If you're Asian and you turn 80, they think you're just an Indian.
I remember when Neil deGrasse Tyson was getting all of that flack for maybe being sexually inappropriate with women. I came up with the witticism. Was it gas, deGrasse, or ass? Nobody rides for free, Tyson.
I don't care how long it took to get there. I like that.
Or what is it? What would it be? Yeah, cash, deGrasse, or ass, Tyson.
That on the other hand, that does make him sound cooler than he is. You know, a couple sexual assaults under his belt would maybe raise him up in the ranking of dude status.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure if people are expecting somebody to come on. I hang out with a lot of poly nerds. I hang out with a lot of um, philosophy nerds, but I'm neither of those things. I don't know why I gravitate towards those kind of folks, but I do. I'm just a sort of everyman, and I don't have a lot of deep, uh, academic wisdom to lay on you, or unique philosophical concepts.
Well,
But
that's
yeah,
what's so interesting is that for this sort of thing that we're talking about, that would essentially work against you. It seems that to because I was going to ask you about this, and there's no wrong answer to this. The you know shoveling on more and more academia to some of these core issues wouldn't even help them. You probably hang out in these scenes too, by the way, because you just like interesting ideas and interesting people. And for my money, this thing we call the dissident right has the most interesting thinkers that you're gonna find. You're not
yeah.
gonna find it anywhere else. There's cool guys talking about interesting shit. That's what you're gonna get over here. And so if you have an open mind, it's the best real estate you're gonna find, and it's free real estate. Uh, sorry, I think I cut you off there.
No, that's okay. I would suggest too, if anybody who wants that sort of philosophical examination of Pentti Linkola, there's really Tamster Tyler Hamilton has a really good podcast, EBL 7, yeah, Euro Bureau Literaturo, episode 7. He has Keith Woods, I believe it's Josh, and oh no, it's Richard Hoke and Fasci Zizek on to discuss Pentti Linkola.
For this one time, I will break my rule of assuming that no other podcast exists, and I will say people should listen to that one. But no other podcast. You only need one. All these people listening to dozens of podcasts. It's very gauche. All you need is one, and it's Blood Satellite. But if you need a second, Mr. Hamilton has got. We had him on not long ago too.
Well, I think I was actually promoting your show when you guys were still in the double digits, early double digits. So
Exactly. I
yeah,
owe a
yeah.
lot to you. This guy. I didn't want to mention. I'll bring it up now. This guy's been my. What's it? What's a good character? A Jiminy Cricket. Jiminy Cricket leading me into parts unknown and showing me off like the belle of the ball.
Well,
Wouldn't be
you
here
got
if it wasn't for this guy, this Mister, the man of the trees.
you were you were getting shout outs from Morgoth back then too, from what just after that, I think, from my recollection. And
Yeah,
he has a pretty big following.
yeah. Morgoth is a fan, and we've said nothing but nice things about him. I was trying to start a rumor that him and Keith Woods were the same guy, but I gave up on that.
No, as a matter of fact, they've been at odds once or twice, but it's never come to blows, thankfully.
Well, that's the thing. I like that. I like because to be fair, to be reasonable on our side, we tend to overreact anytime someone disagrees. Like we're a grown men, and someone will say something, someone politely disagrees. There was no cursing, there's no spitting. Then you're going to get the fucking legion of, oh my god, is this a brother war? Is this a friend holocaust? It's like
Well,
no, it's just men who disagreed for a minute.
well, from what I understand, did you get an invite to Millennial?
Yes, I did.
Wow. Yeah, because there's a whole cadre of people who are essentially persona non grata in the millennial circles, and it has to do with falling out between nativist concern and uh, and um, and millennial woes, which has been an ongoing thing for a few years, and the whole contingencies on either side of sort of drawn lines and taken a side on that. But it should be an interesting millennial, because he was sort of falling into a habit of having the sort of same people on every year, or just like a revolving cast of like maybe 40 people that would come on. But it'll be interesting. He's got a lot of sort of more people in the uh, sort of NRX camp, and just I don't know, how would you describe yourself?
Well, that's what's interesting. So, I would jokingly call myself a fascist monarchist. It what I am is like politically, ideologically, I'm kind of a mixed bag, probably like yourself in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say like I'm not a guy who goes just deep into National Socialist stuff, because I've got my beliefs on what would make a long lasting culture. And then I also have my beliefs of what would make a long lasting political orientation. So usually when I say like fascism, I'm talking about just the way you would organize society and the way it orients itself within sort of the blood and soil and spirituality thing. But then there's other things you have to sort of answer for from an anthropological and spiritual thing, because you can't really have that unless you have some kind of spirituality or you have some kind of history. So that really gets annoyingly autistically complicated.
Yeah.
I would say though, because I've gone so deep into some of these topics, I'm probably more open minded than a lot of people. So, for our show, you will hear us say some, for my money, some of the most extreme stuff you'll hear on any podcast. Like, we get pretty right up to the line on some of the things that we think should happen. That would, but then we also are borderline feminist in a lot of ways. Like, we're pretty, like, we don't hate women like a lot of other guys in our scene do. And so I think when people hear us talk, there's elements of us that will be very surprising to them. And then they'll assume like, oh, these are NRX guys. And no, we're really not. We're probably more, and we're so racist that the type of racism that we do is almost unidentifiable. Like a lot of people on our side.
Well, I would say, like, true diversity is distinct populations living in their own territorial regions, creating their own cultures, maybe they have their own language, and they may cross pollinate with surrounding cultures and races and things like that. And that's the way it's been for, 10,000 years. And so in that way, I would say I'm ethnocentric, but I don't really hate anybody on account of race. I just think that Europeans are valuable, extremely valuable. They're my folk. They're worthy of continuation, and for that, I don't need any other. I don't need any other rationalizations for it than that.
Yeah, because in one sense, no one really has the right to make you have to justify that. And a lot of your detractors or opponents in the political sphere will try and make you answer or justify how you feel or what is kind of what you feel in your soul or your heart. And for a lot of people, unless you want to go down that road, that academic pathway and do, which is what I do, which I don't recommend to anyone, just listen to the show. Don't read all these fucking books like I do. I do this so no one else has to,
Yeah.
just to justify this thing called nationalism, this thing called ethnicity. But then, like I said, once you get deep enough into this, you get insight, because especially the most devout, let's say, like Nazi people, you end up getting into the Indo-European thing. Like, there's a lot of crossover between the Aryan myth and the Indian myth, and there's a lot of connective tissue between like the whole black sun, the Sonorad thing, and like ancient Indian imagery. And we talk about the Kali Yuga, that's an Indian thing. So ironically, you'll see a lot of crossover into other ethnic stuff the more you get into the racial side of things. And that's why I kind of joke that it's very autistic. But you'll end, there's that old tweet that was always going around. It's like, racist people are so annoying. They don't care what race you are as long as you are also racist. And I'm like,
Well,
yeah, kind of.
Well, the thing is like that whole Indo-European thing. I mean, those steppe nomads definitely influenced a lot of cultures. And one of the things that I'm interested, I'm not like, I wouldn't say I'm a national. I wouldn't identify as a national socialist, but I am really interested in the swastika as an image. It's something that really interests me because of its the range, it's the depth of its history, and the oldest recorded swastika ever found was found in Anatolia, and it's almost 12,000 years old, and it depicts a swastika. So that would put it in the domain of like Western hunter gatherers, as having formulated that as a symbol. And I'm sort of I've been collecting materials on it for a long time because I have a theory about Western hunter gatherers. I abide by the theory that Western hunter gatherers reached the east coast of the continental North America around maybe 10,000 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. And interestingly, you can see the swastika in the legacy of native tribes from um, northeastern United States all the way down into New Mexico. So there's this whole dispersal of um, different imagery than that's used than other native groups, different burial customs. They found woven fabric in the Windover site and when in Windover site in Florida, the archaeological site, and when they did DNA testing, they found a distinctly European genome on in the grave inhabitant. So it's I think there's definitely a wide dispersal of Western hunter gatherer into the Americas, and you can see that reflected in the X haplogroup.
Yeah, I. So, are you a follower of the Graham Hancock hypothesis? Because you mentioned the Younger Dryas area, where you're kind of a believer of civilizations being more ancient than even we think.
It's possible. I don't know. I don't think there's enough evidence for it, but there's a lot of indicators that point towards that. I mean, it's definitely it's not an unreasonable hypothesis, especially considering that um, sea level would have been 300 feet lower than it is today, right? So most of the states that would have been around the Mediterranean or on the coastal regions would be well subsumed and covered in silt by now, nearly impossible to find in a lot of cases.
Well, what's interesting is, sorry if everyone were going off into a tangent here, but this
We
is
are.
interesting. But this was when we had covered the book Arctos, which is written by, I believe, just a very very serious woman, but it treated the mythology, sort of the Hyperborean ancient Aryan myth, very of the Nazis, very seriously, and actually looked at the academic foundations of that. And there,
Savitri Devi?
I think her name was Emily Godwin or something. What was it?
Interesting. Go on. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh yeah, so it's a good book. It's called Arctos. It's about the polar myths, and it goes. Rene Guénon is in there. A bunch of these other older esotericists, and there's a lot of layers to this mythology that some are more, I would believe, scientifically grounded than others. So, for example, the stuff about Agartha being just like inside of the hollow earth, well, that was traced back to like a couple writers in the 20th century. The Hyperborean stuff has deeper roots, and that's where we get into Indo-European stuff. So the idea was, you don't necessarily need to believe that Hyperborea, this great northern magical place, was full of energy beings, which is what some of them think. But there was some evidence to indicate that there was a polar migration, that people did come down from the north, way further back than we would conventionally believe. Now, why do we think that? Well, and I'm just going off the top of my head, but it was outlined in the book that when they looked at a lot of the records of travelers at that time, these people would record the star maps of wherever they were. So they said, oh, this settlement is actually way, way further north than we originally thought, because we can tell from their star maps kind of where they're geolocated at the time of them recording it. So they're essentially saying that there was more evidence to back up the idea that there was these great travelers that came down from the north, which would indicate why this matters, is that there's a counter theory to the out of Africa theory. We're not saying people came from the North Pole, but there might be some migrations that go back further than everyone came out of Africa at this time. There might have been human beings way before that, and they might have not had a common ancestor in Africa. Perhaps there was some kind of evolution that happened in parallel. So that's
Yeah,
just
I
one
don't.
theory.
I don't believe in the out of Africa theory the way it's presented now. I believe in a long-standing human habitation in Europe that goes back way further than a couple 100,000 years, with periodic remigrations into Africa because of glaciation. Now, glaciation would also destroy any most of the evidence of any habitation or civilizations that would have inhabited like the northern European region. Also, like glaciers, that's their pretty much their primary function is to grind stone to dust and leave glacial deposits in low-lying areas. That's why we have such an amazing fertile culture in the north. Our forests and our farmlands and everything are far more uh, fertile than equatorial regions, just because of glaciation, periodically churning up minerals and enriching the soil. So when they talk about a polar civilization, like a Hyperborea, or the Arctic myth of the Hyperboreans and stuff, it's quite possible that the frozen wasteland they're referring to doesn't have to be the Arctic Circle. It could be Germany, depending on the the period of glaciation.
Yeah, see, like all that stuff lines up completely. And just because we don't have the precise timeline of what happened, when people say there's a possibility of this or that, I'm open minded, and I don't understand people who try and shut that down the moment they hear it, that that's a conspiracy theory. I'm like, well, like this is very like in the fog of history stuff anyway. So why can't we entertain this idea? And so that's why we're academic wars of theories get very, very frustrating to me. There is a documentary on, I think it's Netflix right now. It's called Ancient Apocalypse with Graham Hancock.
Yeah, I watched a couple episodes of that.
I did not like it as much as I thought it would. What is, before we
No.
go on, what's your appraisal of that?
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that.
It
I
was a bit
concur.
too much of him, a bit too much. I would have liked it if he was more of a narrator rather than the star. There's a lot of slow motion shots of a fucking drone camera flying up and floating around his face while he stares very seriously into it. I'm like, I think they made this because he was on the Joe Rogan Experience. They had some name recognition, but I'm like, this comes across as very ancient aliens, and I think that discredits the entire thing.
Yeah, I read a lot of his books like over the years, and it's like it's like popcorn archaeology, right? I mean, he's not an archaeologist; he's a journalist. He repeatedly he states that it's just this is a theory of his, and I mean there is a lot of merit to some of the research that he puts forward, but in other respects, yeah, it just smacks of History Channel sort of. I'm not saying there was a global uni civilization, but it was a global uni civilization, you know?
Yeah, like you're with them up until a point. You're with them up until, okay, we're talking about human beings in whatever configuration they were in existing before, but he has to go that extra step and say there was one great hyper advanced civilization that was like the patient zero for all civilizations. I mean, you don't need to make that leap. You had a really fascinating thesis right up until that, you know?
Yeah, well, a lot of times people take a theory one step too far and then alienate, a huge swath of people. But I am a believer that most of the major religions and religious ideologies that we know today were originally astro theological cults at one point. I think that's where a lot of our myths and heroes stories and things come from. Is their analogies to the movement of the certain stars and constellations and different ages.
Yeah, well,
As
speaking of the swastika, maybe my swastika lore is lacking, but it was my understanding that it was sort of a representation of the North Star or some kind of. It's tracking like
yeah,
the
the
circular
Big
pattern.
Dipper. the Big Dipper in um, uh, all four seasons is how I've heard a lot of people describe it, like revolving around the North Star. So spring, winter solstice, spring and fall equinox, and then summer solstice. So yeah, I've heard that theory put forward too. Right?
I hope that we're not running afoul of a lot of, fashy deep lore guys out there who are writing a couple essays at us right now. Like, actually,
Yeah, right. Let us know. Let us know in the comments.
if there's one thing I like, the reason I get out of bed and log on a Telegram first thing is I just want to get lectured. Oh man! So I'm going to get back to Linkola.
Yeah, let's do that.
Sorry. And actually, to before what you were saying is, I just want to give you some credit because we were talking about the types of people who are very academic and very into the theory and philosophy. And what I like about you and what I like about things like this or systems like this is that, it's very easy to wander off into the theory and become what I lovingly call a theory cell. But eventually you get to a point and you say, to what end? Why am I doing this? And what I appreciate about you, like you call yourself, a simple guy. You're not, you find this stuff interesting, but you're not trying to create a library of references in your head because you don't need to answer like what now. You actually have a plan. You know what you believe in, and you don't need, like I said, a library of references to prove it. And I think where a lot of people, like myself included, get wrong is we can wander into the woods of ideas and then you lose yourself. Like, wait, why am I even doing this? How does this map onto the real world in any way? And I don't think you have to worry about that, which is what I appreciate.
Well, what I think is that's one of the reasons that the ideas of Pentti Linkola run afoul with people is because not very many people are prepared to look at it as starkly as he did. Not many people are willing to um, assign guilt to themselves. Like one of his ideas was that uh, he called them enlightened or unenlightened people who are of higher intellect or lower. He said it's of no consequence because neither one of them recognizes the most glaring problem in humanity, which is overpopulation and mass destruction of our ecological resources. And he didn't even really view them as resources. Like he would put it forth as resources, but I mean, these are ecological systems that have persisted for, hundreds of thousands of years, and we've managed to lay waste to them in less than a century. Like at one point, one of the earlier explorers wrote a quote that he said, if a squirrel jumped from tree to tree, he could go from Hudson's Bay to Florida without ever touching the ground. Now, I'm not sure if people have ever driven on the eastern seaboard these days, but those forests are mostly gone. I mean, and you can see these examples all the way back through history. Like a lot of the timber and things that were traded in the ancient world went to build temples and domiciles and things like that in Sumer. They didn't have adequate knowledge to keep their agrarian systems going, and they basically just farmed out the land until it ran out. And like people always want to assign like, oh, it a drought came and ended the civilization, but sometimes human impact on ecosystems can change weather patterns. Like you can see that in the West Coast, like on Vancouver Island and coastal British Columbia, the winters are a lot less wet than they used to be because of mass deforestation. They used to perform what was called of the cloud. It used to be called a cloud forest because these massive ancient trees would transpire and catch ocean systems and trap them on the coast, and you would have like heavy rains and long lasting fogs and stuff like that. But the more we've deforested and the more we've defoliated these areas, the more it's starting to resemble the climates of maybe like Northern California or Oregon, which are drier winters, and and less persistent rains in the winter. So you know, when people talk about the carbon emergency, like the climate emergency because of um, carbon excess from fossil fuels, I think that people overlook that we've massively defoliated 5 continents. Like, because when we first arrived here, uh, like North America, South America, where the forests were largely intact. Uh, uh, Africa hadn't been over harvested for timber, like valuable timbers like ebony and paddock and African mahoganies and things like that. And even in Europe, we've massively defoliated our ancient forests for like all the ancient oaks and things that existed in Europe and Europe and the British Isles and stuff like that were cut down for cathedrals, shipbuilding, and things like that during the just before the industrial era, when the entire global trade and warfare was based on naval power. So this happens a lot throughout history. We can see even in the Bible, you can see an example of Judea harvesting the cedars of Lebanon, right? And if you ever go to Lebanon today, there's nothing that would even remotely resemble what existed there in biblical times. It's just a bunch of tree lots that are allowed to grow to a certain level of maturity before they're harvested and sent to market, right? And it's the exact same thing we're doing in British Columbia right now. People look at a map and say, we have lots of forests left, but we don't have forests. What you're seeing is tree lots.
That's interesting because when people will do I don't know if you call it clear cutting, but they will do deforestation. They'll say, "Oh, well, we are growing the trees back." And I think you pointed to an interesting problem, which is that I think a common issue with environmentalists is they really pick their specific, almost a hobby issue. Like when I look at vegans, they only seem to be into it insofar as it's anthropomorphizing animals. You don't want to be mean to animals. They actually don't seem to give a shit about anything else. And then everyone else, if they're environmentalists, they're laser focused on fossil fuels. But that's what I liked about Linkola, which is he's taking an 10,000 foot view of the problem, knowing that, well, solving one of these problems actually doesn't really resolve anything. You would need to rip out, pardon the phrasing, rip out by the roots a lot of other things that we take for granted right now. Does that sound correct?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when people latched onto carbon emissions, but they haven't really examined the problem of mass deforestation as the removals of huge carbon sinks. Like, forests aren't the largest carbon sink; the ocean is, but forests were definitely um, locking up like literally billions, probably more, of carbon in the old growth forests. And so when we now what they're doing is environmentalists are applauding renewable energy like wood chips to burn as alcohol fuel. But what they do is, instead of burning coal, which is just comes out of a hole in the ground, they're devastating literally thousands of acres and just chipping it into pellets that they can burn to create electricity. So not only are they creating the same amount of carbon, they're also creating a huge disaster in the wild for habitat issues for endangered animals, and animals which are going endangered. Like, recently, I just learned about the monarch butterflies are on the threatened list now, and all it would take to ensure their survival is Mexico to be able to conserve a few hundred acres of forest where they migrate for their breeding cycle, and they can't even do that. And I got into a lot of trouble on Telegram for stating out loud that, like, Mexicans, if they can't even protect a few hundred acres of forest, like, what fucking good are they? Um, it's like they got angry at me for that. But if the shoe was on the other foot, if there was like a rare Mexican bird that required 1,000 acres of Canadian woodland to ensure their survival, and we couldn't even guarantee that for them, I would be absolutely embarrassed. I'd be ashamed of myself.
Well,
So,
you raised an interesting point, and we don't need to drift too much into this area of inquest, but I wonder if it's primarily Western people who care this much about this stuff, or in the case of Mexico, but like let's talk Scandinavia is interested in it, and like Europeans broadly. But from my perspective, I don't see these sorts of conversations really happening in China, in South America, and elsewhere. Does that sound right, or am I being too harsh?
well, I see examples, like I see like examples of maybe an African game warden who puts his life on the, or, they put their life on the line defending African elephants from poachers and things, right? Like, you see stories like that. But in terms of like the whole the social strata and things like that, if that's like a relevant topic to them or not, I'm not sure. I couldn't say with any authority whether it is or not. But I hear a lot of talk about a deep indigenous appreciation for the land and stuff like that. And I've actually grew up beside a reservation and spent a lot of time on the reservation, and so much so in my late teens that you could pretty much say I lived there. And I'll tell you what I didn't see. It was a deep appreciation for nature.
Thank you,
Um, we would
fucking
go
thank you.
we would go out hunt. We would go out hunting turkey and grouse, and they would shoot at anything that moved, like a squirrel, or they would anything that they could blast. They would shoot at it, and it got to the point where I just didn't want to go hunting with them anymore because we came back empty handed every time. And there's a lot of they say, oh, there's a lot of indigenous wisdom when it comes to preserving uh, the ecosystem and living in harmony with nature and stuff. But I think they just didn't have the technology to exploit it, to be quite honest. Like, it's hard to say if they would have been as carnivorous as we are when it comes to extracting resources. But you can see it in other cultures like China and Africa. It's definitely conservatism is not on the menu.
Yeah,
Only when it
you want to piss
when
off
it's
some
important.
Aboriginals. Just say if you had the ability to exterminate the bison, you would have done it. You just couldn't.
Well, I'm not saying that either. Like, like, I'm not saying that they would have, you know, killed all the bison or anything like that. But um, we Europeans do have to take responsibility for our voracious appetite and resource consumption, for sure. I do firmly believe that as well.
What's also interesting about Linkola is what I like about him. Again, even if if we're being honest, I am more into like a weird, almost Nick Land techno future thing, only because I seem to see it as inevitable. That's why, just back to the earlier point about my political orientation, like that's why I have a hard time grappling with some of these ideologies, because I haven't found a single ideology that addresses all of the issues that I think need to be addressed. Some people will push back on that, but within each the big ones, all the big ones people kind of put on their profiles, like I don't see people talking about this sort of ecology in a serious way. I don't see them grappling with technology in a serious way. And so that's why I don't think you could really have, like, if you're dealing with someone who's being honest or being halfway intelligent, they won't have a political brand that they side with. And that's why I enjoy talking to people like yourself, because like these are very, very serious issues. And if you're treating these issues seriously, you have to come at them like Linkola, because if you're coming at the ecology thing, like every example you gave up until now is very, very poignant. It's very relevant. And so to solve that, you have to have big solutions. So, almost to correct, to turn the clock back on the Industrial Revolution, which is essentially what we're talking about, you would have to change the behavioral patterns of people, either change them or get some kind of mass die off going. Like you said, and he's being like, okay, to do that, it's going to get ugly for a while. But I was wondering what you thought of that. Like, do you think to accomplish this ideal world, it would require a re-engineering of human behavior on, let's say, a global scale, or a complete reshuffling of the deck, something like that?
Well, where our nest was embedded in academia. And I heard someone say that because Linkola eschewed academia, he went to university only for 1 year, and then decided it wasn't for him. He thought academia was just a part and parcel with you know the system, that the machine that is the system, right? It props up and validates the machine, which is the system, which is destroying ecological habitat. So, but he didn't have the checks and balances that somebody like Arne Ness or another academic type had in his expositions, because he could say whatever he want. Because what are they going to do? Take away the fish? I mean, there's no way that they could impact upon him, his livelihood or his way of living, because he lived like an austere monk, and made his living by the strength of his hands and of his back. I think. Sorry, that didn't really answer the question, but yeah, I do think that major changes are coming, whether uh, we want them to or not. And the people I see putting forward the solutions right now, like the WEF and stuff, Klaus Schwab and all that, I'm not really on their page. I would like to see somebody with a more Lincoln attitude at the forefront of these movements. Because Lincoln makes Schwab look like a pansy, really, with
Yeah.
his suggestion. People are making Schwab out to be a James Bond villain, but all he wants you to do is change your diet and use lithium-ion batteries, right? I don't think these people really are arbiters of change. I think they're just mouthpieces for, this new sort of epoch that they want to bring about, which I think will basically be a two-tiered system. You'll be eating the bugs, you'll be riding a bicycle, but they'll still be flying on private jets and eating steak medallions and lobster tails.
Yeah, and with on in regards to the Klaus Schwab thing, what's interesting is not long ago we watched this documentary about the COVID vaccine called "Died Suddenly." And anytime you get into the COVID stuff, you get into the World Economic Forum, the WEF, you get into this sort of elite theory type stuff. And then the thing that I noticed was, what's interesting is you can pull all of the video clips and the speeches and the presentations that these people give, and they all bring up depopulation or population control in some way. And many, China had a form of population control for the longest time. I don't think they do anymore, but the one child policy. But it seems that on the tip of everyone's tongue is this. They described it as a Malthusian plot, referring to the Dr. Malthus, who came up with the idea that, look, our population's going out of control. We're going to run out of resources. You're going to have to either decrease births or increase deaths. So it seems to me that depopulation in some form is on the tips of the tongues of a lot, not just evil elites, but serious academics like Linkola, who are looking at the problem. It's like, look, we need to do something about this here. And like you had said, once I read him, I look at someone like Klaus Schwab and say, oh, you're kind of on the same page, but you're using the same language. But like you said, I think they're going to end up with some kind of weird technocratic system. But like, I think there's going to be depopulation at some point. It's whether it's going to be on purpose or not. and it's going to be whether it's got certain people in charge of it or not. But I think it's coming, and I think for some, maybe the Linkola world will become very real very fast for them. Does that
Well,
sound fair?
Well, Pentti Linkola wasn't always the based and red pill guy that we know now, too. Like he went through an evolution of thought. You can see in his earlier writings, he actually wrote in favor of pacifism and stuff. Whereas his later writings, he said that in nature there's nothing more natural than violence. When he was younger, he dedicated one book that supposedly I've never been able to get a copy of it. It was his it's My Life as a Dissident or something of that nature, and I think that I don't think there's any English translations that I've been able to find, but he actually dedicated it to the Red Army faction, which was a German sort of communist, I think, sort of brigade that was going in the 60s and 70s, and that brushed up with deep ecological intellectuals. And he he only becomes like more one might say misanthropic, and develops a negative opinion of humanity's ability to change later on in his writings. You can see that in Can Life Prevail? That's when he starts to move towards a more authoritarian idea of how to basically force the population into this sort of ecological authoritarian order. He said that the China one child policy was one of the greatest things that happened in the 20th century. But we all see now a lot of the problems that arise from like ideas that sound good on paper, but they can lead to unforeseen complications down the road. Um, he was more of like a Finnish people. He wasn't really a nationalist, like in the sense of identity, but he was so in love with Finland and the idea of like the Finnish wildlife and stuff, that he's naturally equated with the land and the people of Finland. And so his ideas took on an evolution, and he got more and more harsh and stark in his edicts as he got a little bit older.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting is that, like you said, he wasn't a nationalist, but he was a naturalist. So he was in favor of borders insofar as deserts have borders. Like there's
Yeah.
bear populations have their borders that are negotiated. So like and I remember him talking about, like, he mentions that in Can Life Prevail, I believe.
Well,
That's
he's strictly anti-immigration, so that de facto makes him a nationalist, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, but he was like, in a sense, nature is nationalist in that sense, because there is conflicts of different populations butting up against, and then they negotiate that through combat or through mating or whatnot. But he's also like, look, I remember in the book he had said, I'm gonna get the number wrong, but something like he had traversed like fucking 10,000 square kilometers of forest, something crazy like that. Like he just knew though these forests, these old growth forests, like the back of his hand. And so he was like you couldn't get more of a Finnish person. So even if he might not agree in these Cartesian borders, he did believe in this thing called the Finnish region, in a sense. So I always found that kind of interesting too.
Yeah, and he drew a distinction. Like he wasn't overtly political, like in terms of ideology, but he drew a distinction between the impact that certain ideologies had on the environment compared to others. Because there, I guess, a huge swath of what was Finnish territory got chewed up by the Soviet Union and never returned. So he saw the differences between the population of Finns in the Soviet whatever you would call them, occupied territories, and the Finnish Western liberal capitalist order. And he saw like massive ecological devastation on one side of the line, but on the other side of this border, he saw people who were largely unable to execute, the designs of like industry because of the limitations and the contradictions and in the Soviet world. Like as far as they wanted to create a egalitarian proletariat, they were unable to really industrialize the way the West did, and maybe that was a part of the reason that um, they didn't, is because maybe they didn't have the brain trust that we did. I don't know. Maybe it was just a corrupt and antiquated system that was, where people were distrustful of one another. But for whatever reason, on this one side on the Soviet side of the line, they were unable to go along with in the industrialization of their area. And so it's virgin forests and people still working with hand tools. And he saw the children like playing like, with their imaginations and enjoying the woodlands and stuff. And whereas in Finland he would see kids on dirt bikes and going on logging roads and motorboats, and unable to entertain themselves without more and more elaborate technologies. Right, that was one of his criticisms of the West, was that the more technological we get, the less we are able to entertain ourselves with simple technologies anymore. We have to create more and more elaborate technologies. I mean, I heard you on the Sunflower Society. That was a really interesting dialogue there you guys had. And they touched on this a little bit with AI, post-humanism, and that sort of idea. And I think that's like a hyper extension of what I was just discussing there.
Yeah, an interesting way to look at it, like you were just saying, it's that we're getting further away from the human's ability to be at peace in nature. And I'll say what I mean by that. So, in that interview with the Sunflower Society, we kind of got to a point where we're talking about how, a way this could work out with in the sort of transhumanism world is that you don't make AI that is as smart or competent as a human. You just make humans, you bring them down to the level of a machine. You make them more and more compartmentalized, more specialized, more cogs in a machine. I'm kind of paraphrasing it here, but what you notice is that the human starts to lose the ability to exist on its own in nature, to be at peace, to stand in the forest and know what to do. Someone like Linkola, you drop him in the middle of the woods, he knows how to survive. He knows how to be at one with his environment. And what you get with the modern man is they don't know how to be at one with their environment. And you'll see, Christ, I mean, it will break your heart sometimes to see. You'll see young people like they're scared of the woods. You see some of these like millennials and Gen Z, they're like, I'm driving by the woods, I look at them, I feel like the worst thing in the world could be going in the woods. I don't know. There's no lights, there's no electricity. So we've lost that part of us maybe forever, where you can be at peace, you can be quiet, you can listen to the woods, you can close your eyes and feel this it's like a cocktail of awe and total balance. And then there's entire generations that just won't experience that, and that will be so they'll be psychologically damaged all the time, and they won't fucking know why. And I think that at a deeper level, that's kind of what occurs. I went on a bit of a tangent there, I
Well,
apologize.
people even like a lot of the ways that people interact, like urbanites will interact with more rural settings, is already sort of a fetishization of it. Like like if you go out to do a sport in nature, or you go camping to recharge, it's like, so what you're saying is essentially the environment you're in is discharging you, and that you're coming to nature to recharge. It's like, well, wouldn't the logically follow just to be closer to nature would keep you perpetually charged? You know what I mean? Like people can't seem to make even those simple connections. But technology is supposed to make our lives easier and more enriched. But honestly, people seem more disconnected and unhappy than ever. So I don't see how putting a chip in your brain or putting a robot arm is really going to push you over the top of the experience, the experiential ladder into pure bliss.
Yeah, one thing I'd said, because you make a point there that putting an AI chip in your head and kind of becoming something that is inhuman, because a lot of these transhumanists and a lot of the people who talked very excitedly about this sort of future, it's not said as directly, but what they kind of imply is that they're just going to churn through the natural resources of Earth to get there. So, like, we don't give a shit about trees, we don't get about water. That's just here to feed our creations. So, I was talking about this in a voice message a while ago. It was about the difficulty. I'm sorry if we start talking about AI again, but this is relevant, I promise. The point is that if it's difficult to create an AI that is like a human mind unless it exists in the physical form in the real world. Now, what I mean by that is that a mind and a consciousness can't exist in an abstract. It needs to be able to orient itself with sight and smell and position and be able to feel things, to because that those inputs, that those sensory inputs change how you think and the thoughts you have. And one example I gave is that the fact that we exist in a world where there is this thing called the sky, and the sky is up, and over time the sky represents boundless possibilities. It represents heaven. It represents, and and that affects you, is that when you're thinking, sometimes you will look up. But the fact that we have grown up in a world where we are balanced with nature is it's so ingrained in our DNA, the experience of being in the world. And if you rob us of that, we become inhuman. I guess that's what I'm trying to fumble my way to, that the more you separate people from the environment, and this isn't just hippie shit, people, this is the right in the fucking DNA of your self, your race, your ethnicity, however you want to conceptualize it. There's a lot of different ways to look at this, but the more you separate yourself from that nature, I believe you become less human. So I don't like when people speak very flippantly about, like, oh yeah, everything on Earth is just a slave to our galactic imaginations. That's not how I like to look at it, because that's like saying, oh, I just don't want to be a human anymore. I'm like, well, that you think that can't go wrong? Let's see. Anyway.
Well, it's like it gets downright Jungian at that point. It's like, how can you infuse into an AI the way that just the ineffable sensation you get of just from like a Jungian archetype, like how it embeds itself into you in an ineffable way, like the way humans are in awe of fire. That's I don't see how we can ever train a machine to have that sort of sensory input, you know. And but the thing is with Pentti Linkola, I mean, he gets accused of being misanthropic and a genocidal maniac, but what he's in favor of man in balance with nature, and an overpopulation of humans is an imbalance with nature. But one of the criticisms that people level at him is that his vision seems to imply like this static relationship with nature, where um, people will never get to progress, or you know what I mean, like we'll never get to go through like culminations and ages and different epochs, because he's imposing like a static relationship between man and nature, which I think is there is some merit to that argument. Like, especially Europeans have a very restless spirit. Like we have a very um, innovative, a very exploratory nature, and not nourishing that. I wonder what sort of like we've seen what kind of neuroses manifest from putting humans into an entirely artificial um, environment like a city, like sort of a rat utopia, but for humans, right? Like where every need is provided for them and stuff, and every excess and pleasure is able to be explored without guilt-free and without consequence, right? And all kinds of different neurotic tendencies arise from that. But imposing an order where someone has to live in like a static relationship with their environment also is something that deserves some consideration. And so I unfortunately my other computer took a shit on me, but I've been sort of typing out like a lot of ideas I had for how people could be in a more productive relationship with their ecosystems, a more in more of a stewardship role, like
Do you have
um,
any off the top of your head? Because I'd love to
well,
go into
just
that.
yeah, like a forestry worker who is also like a some not you're not just a feller, but you're also in charge of the health of the forest as well. So it's a more rounded position. Like you are not just taking resources for market, but you're also fostering generations of forests to come, right? And different ways of approaching forestry, um, like right now they just they cut down everything that's there and replace it with the fastest growing most commercially viable trees available, and they that will grow in that area, and then they grow clones, millions of clones of the same tree sometimes. So the genetic diversity you're looking at, like you're thinking this is a forest I'm looking at, but you're not. You're looking at a factory, and a lot of the things that used to habitate in that area of forest can no longer dwell there because the very substance of the forest itself has been so irrevocably changed, right?
It's true. And what's interesting is like I like that idea. I like the idea of it's almost anti-specialization, and it's increasing. We're at a point where we need to take a more holistic approach to this, and this is kind of where I'm at politically with things. It's that you know, barring any sort of fantastic collapse scenario, like there's things we could be doing now to as a paradigm shift of how we balance our like you had said, our European desire to strike out into the unknown, to climb the mountain because it's there, and to not be restless, but also with this increased stewardship. And I think we're at a position in civilizational advancement that we could introduce more advanced stewardship responsibilities onto individuals and less of this sort of industrial revolution. I'm just a cog in a machine. I just chop down trees. Like I think we can actually kind of step up, and that's what I like about Canada. Canada is a fascinating country because we really only have like three big cities, if we're being honest. Like, we got Vancouver, you got Toronto, Ottawa kind of counts, but I'm thinking Montreal.
Montreal.
But the rest is towns, the rest is villages, and the rest is we're laughing about this. I talked to like Americans a lot. I'm like, you have no idea how just there's nothing going on in Canada. I drive to another town, it's all forest, it's all cryptids. It's great, but it's like more than any country I could think of. Maybe Russia it would have the similar thing, but I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of people here who are already kind of on that line of being in nature all the fucking time. There's not as much
Yeah.
pressure cookers as there are in the US, I think.
Yeah, and we have to get away from this idea of like, um, there's these people who are like, oh, all we have to do is plant trees on the patios of buildings and put grass on the roof and on top of the bus stops and wildflowers, and then that's going to go a long way into towards preservation and conservation and fostering wildlife and stuff. But it's not. It's just a feel good measure designed to make people more comfortable in their consumption than to really have to take a hard look at themselves. If they really wanted to make a serious change, changing the actual construction methods that we use would be a great place to start, because um, unfortunately, uh, the demise of a building is a standard home in Canada is baked right into the cake. It's about 80 years usually, right, before the wood starts to break down and rot, and the gypsum starts crumbling, and it gets to a point where it's not even worth restoring anymore. Where it's a tear down and rebuild situation. It's like, what do they call that when they um I can't think of it right now at the top of my head, where they build the oh fuck into so that the products need to be
Oh,
constantly
planned obsolescence.
planned obsolescence. Yeah, we don't understand how baked into the cake that is, as just a Western capitalist idea. It's not just in products; it's actually based in like generations too, right? Like, um, it's like when they needed when they needed people to sail the seas and go rob the foreign nations of their treasures and bring them back to England, they foster that. When they need someone to hate the Indians, they'll instill a hate in you so that you go and fight the Western Front. If they need someone who to farm or whatever, then and cultivate the land and generate riches for your overlords, then they instill that as well. It's just there's never been an epoch in history where the masses haven't been used as a tool of engineering for the elites.
You know, it makes me wonder. You're making a lot of very, very sensible points. I find this all very fascinating. And I wonder, aside from Linkola, are you aware of any other thinkers, writers, or speakers in that same, any compatriots of Linkola that are kind of out there right now that you might recommend to people?
I don't actually. There's this guy, I forget his name. He wrote a book called Dark Ecology, and from the overview I got of it, I was pretty excited about it. But the uh entire green movement is so infused with this whole notion of like social justice now. It's actually sabotaging any good that could potentially come of it. I mean, when you look back on the history of environmental movements in the United States, say the Sierra Club was anti-immigration for environmental reasons. And then at one point, somebody, I think it might have been even been Richard Branson, injected $300 million into the organization on the contingency that they not talk about immigration anymore. And just like that, boom, their positions changed overnight. And I think there's a lot of that. I mean, a lot of that sort of sabotage coming from elite incentivization. Uh, you know, and
It's
there,
interesting. It sounds like the ecology movement, environmental movement, at one point were serious heavy hitters enough to be subverted and sabotaged to what they are now, and a lot of people would forget about that.
yeah, well, the so-called environmental movement in the West really gained steam in the 70s. I mean, when I was a kid, I worked for Greenpeace for a little while, and y- um, it didn't take me long to figure out it was just a racket. You know what I mean? They would go get an army of people who go in door to door, begging for donations, selling this magazine, which was nothing but fear porn, and uh, 85% or more of the money that you collected went to administrative fees, right? And then a lot of the other money that they earmarked for campaigns was just them pulling ridiculous stunts that were essentially advertisements for them as well. So it's like the Sierra Club and the Greenpeace and them, I think they did become major players because they could um, have some sort of political cachet there for a long time. But I think, yeah, most of them have been bought out and subverted by academics and rich industrialists and stuff.
It's funny that you mentioned Greenpeace because when I was younger, very, very brief amount of time, I worked for World Vision, and I was just doing door to door sales, like collecting sponsorships, collecting money, and it was very much the same thing. Where ostensibly, World Vision was supposed to be feeding hungry kids around the world, and this was all based on there's starving kids in Africa. But then, during your orientation, or at some point, I remember getting a PowerPoint presentation of like, okay, here's a diagram of where the money's going, and like the again, 80% of it was going to administrative fees. And they had to say this legally. And then you're wondering, okay, how much was this triangle graph worth? Because we're supposed to be collecting for, kids with flies on their faces. But this is all going to just, like you said, magazines, all this shit. Um, it's interesting that you have such a history in the environmental movement too. So, do you did you have a lot of insider knowledge on things that they're doing wrong outside of Greenpeace?
Well, not really. I came out west, and I hooked up with a lot of people who were involved with Sea Shepherds there, Paul Watson and stuff. And those guys, I would say, of anybody who are out there, put put every cent into doing what they can to stop illegal whaling and stuff like that. Like they literally take fire. Like they've been, shot at, they've been harpooned, they've been rammed, and you're in the middle of the open ocean, right? Like these people who are ramming you, are the only people you're relying on to save you if you get a breach in your hull. I would say those guys, if I had to look on it, I would say those guys are doing some really good work. They have had some actual success with pressuring, certain countries. I think it's Japan was one of the major culprits to stop whaling,
Yeah.
or at least curtail their whaling activities. And then there's a lot of like eco terrorists and stuff out there. And now there's this. I'm not sure if you've been watching the news, but there's this cell of people who have been harassing the gas pipelines in BC and Alberta, and they go in like military style and destroy the camps and send the people fleeing, just sabotage their machines and everything, and then just evaporate into the woods. Nobody has any idea who these people are, but they keep striking. I think their last target was a headquarters for an oil and gas company. They went and just destroyed every vehicle on the lot so that they couldn't go into the forest and do their surveying and all that sort of stuff.
I think I see
Um,
an article here. It's the Wet'suwet'en Nation condemns Northern BC pipeline attack as new images. So, for people who don't appreciate the irony of this, these were the same Aboriginal groups who were protesting the pipeline. Now they're protesting that someone's trying to take away the pipeline.
well, it's funny you mentioned that. It was I'm not sure if you remember the Clayoquot Sound protests. There was this logging company, I think it was CanWest Forest Products. They wanted to go in and log this massive stand of old growth forest in Clayoquot Sound, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island here. Um, so the people who were involved in the save the forest campaigns rounded up every smelly hippie you can imagine on the west coast to come out and protest, and there was like a literal uh, army of like patchouli wearing dreaded retards out there trying to stop this cutting of the old growth. And I happened to be one of them at the time. And so the natives set up there with their drums, and they were for the protesters and stuff. And so a little while later, they said, "Oh, we've reached a conclusion, or we've reached an agreement with the native bands. We're only going to selectively harvest and all this sort of stuff." And so what happened was, it didn't take me long. I was like, I can always smell jive. Is money made its way into the right hands in the native councils and stuff, right? And then as soon as they met their price, then it was full steam ahead on the logging, and they just went in and did whatever the hell they were going to do in the first place, anyways. But it was, um, it's interesting how they could mobilize this entire army. Like there was literally 10,000, maybe 15,000 people out there at one point, protesters, good natured, big hearted people who just wanted to save a bit of rainforest. And, one day they had the natives' blessing. The next day, it was all sorted with the natives, and then next thing you know, the forest was cut down anyway, right? Because money made its way into the right hands, and I see that happening again here on Vancouver Island. There's another logging protest called Fairy Creek, and it's another old growth site that they want to mill down, mow down. And at first, the natives were completely on board with the protesters and by any means necessary. And then before long, it's like, oh, we've reached a settlement with the natives, and that just basically means money has been exchanged for the right to do whatever the hell they were going to do in the first place. And they use these young 20 somethings with big hearted people with, to come out, and they use them as cannon fodder, basically, right? They're the ones getting maced. They're the ones getting beat up by police and dragged off. They're living in the frozen mud for weeks on end, eating rice and beans. Like, you know what I mean?
Well,
It's
that's
just,
that's an angle that I never heard of before, because it's kind of an open secret here in Ontario where I live, but all throughout Canada, that these Aboriginal groups, this is just a shakedown to them. They don't really give a shit about the land, and everyone, they say, okay, we're gonna go. They're gonna beat their drums and they're gonna cause a fuss, but everyone knows that they just want to get paid, and if they're doing this, they haven't gotten paid enough. But I never considered that they were taking advantage of all the hippie kids to be, the front line. We'll fight for you. We'll fight for your land, and then they're the ones who are out there eating the beans and rice, as you say.
yeah, in the frozen mud, getting maced by the police, right? But that's something I noticed in BC. That's not something I've noticed anywhere else. But who's to say that wasn't happening with the Dakota pipeline? Um, I don't know. I don't know the ins and outs. I didn't really follow that one very closely. But when I was growing up, like I said, all my best friends were native, and I hung out on the res a lot. And that was my first sort of racial awakening. And it came at the hands of native people, not European people, because when the Caledonia land crisis kicked off, the first one, there was a bitter division between people who had been friends since like they were knee high to a grasshopper, go out on the weekends, playing sports together, drinking, breaking bread together. Overnight, the whole town divided between white and native, right? And seeing as I was on friends with mostly native people, I was like, "Oh, I'll help you guys out. I'll do whatever I can for you, or whatever." And they were like, "Not this time. You can't. You can't do that. Not this time. You're not welcome. You got to be with your side on this one." And being back then, I was just like a colorblind liberal dipshit, just a young kid, right? And I didn't understand it for a while, but they were like, "That's just the way it is," when it comes down to allegiances. That I could never really help them in any meaningful way, and that other it wasn't maybe my friends that would oppose my presence there, but there would be people who would, and instead of the hassle, they were just like, "No, you
Well,
can't
that's
be
like
part of this."
it's sad to say, but even your friends who would want you there would say, "Do us a favor and don't show up because
Yeah,
you're going to make it hard for
exactly.
me."
That's exactly what it was. And my brother, one of the guys that I would consider closest to me in my life was a native guy, and he went on to go down to Oka after that, and he was on the Kanesatake Bridge during that whole protest, and that protest was wild. Like I don't think that was a shakedown at all. I really think that those Mohawks are really they're really serious about reclaiming questionable treaty land, because they got into open firefight with the military and everything, right? Like they weren't fucking around. So when you say natives in Canada, it's in my experience, every band is different. Like every nation has its own character. Like it's they can be quite different. Uh, quite a stark contrast between them.
I agree with that, and that's why I try and fight the archetype of all the natives being the stewards of nature, which is kind of, there's Mohawk territory that I've driven through all the time, and it's like, oh, here's 9 gas stations and 9 weed stores right in a row. So it's like, do you just like having the land, or do you see yourselves as a steward of nature, or are you just looking for, political capital in the form of land too? And again, every single one's different, especially if you go up north. The more north you go, you meet like a different class of a band up there too. I would assume most of the ones in Ontario are just corporations with feathers, but
Well,
there are real ones out there too.
I think they're taking advantage of whatever. I think they're taking advantage of whatever economic incentives they're throwing. Like, if they can regulate their own land and make a casino there, they will. If they can sell cigarettes, a buck cheaper to white folks, they will. I mean, I've seen a lot of, definitely like bootlegging and stuff like that when I was out there and stuff. So there was some, I don't know about all natives, but the ones I grew up with, there was sort of this romance for the sort of like the outlaw sort of lifestyle too, right? Like where they wanted to make their money and be free of the man and do it in a way that was sort of, you know what I mean? Like a bootlegging or weed dealing or have
Yeah.
a little grow show out there or whatever. And they were different in that they weren't house proud, but every one of them had a nice vehicle. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And
So
that's it.
it harkens back to like when they had a horse and a teepee. Like, a teepee was just somewhere to crash, but their horse was really important to them.
That's a fascinating way of looking at it, because I did not grow up near a reserve, but I had friends who did, who lived out in like Brantford and stuff. And so they had a very, very intimate knowledge. And I say that as if anyone knows where the fuck that is. No one, it's in Ontario. It's a town very close to a reserve. And they get stories for days about stuff like that. I hate to sound like we're laying in too much on the Aboriginals here, but if we are talking about groups who say they're into environmentalism, who aren't, like vegans, like modern, like maybe the Extinction Rebellion, that they're in the news right now. I'm like, I don't, I see a lot of PETA, which is, I think you guys just want to have a PR agency, and this is just a way for you can kind of have fun and be in the news. But I don't know what the end goal of any of that is. And I think that is what you need to do. I think to be a serious individual like yourself, like others, is you need to think, okay, what are we actually trying to map onto the real world realistically?
Yeah.
And there's
Well,
not a lot of people asking that.
I have a lot of respect for natives in some way. I mean, I can understand the way they feel about being a conquered people and stuff like, or I can empathize with them at least, um, in that way. And I'm still salty at the Romans a little bit as a Briton, coming from the British Isles. But so those resentments run deep,
Well, hey,
and
look, like they hate being conquered, so do whites, so do
yeah.
Europeans, so we got that in common.
Exactly, and we're going through a systematic replacement at the moment ourselves. So, I mean, we may be in a situation where we can really sympathize with them soon.
Yeah, look, we have our own reserves as well. It's called Detroit. It's called these fucking cities.
Well, getting back to Linkola, is like where he got in trouble was during the migrant crisis. There, he was saying they asked him if all these migrants that should be put back on boats and taken back to Libya, and he said no, just sink the boats. so, so he was definitely outspoken on that, and he said that we're largely responsible for the population explosion in Africa too. Like I hear people complain about it all the time and the migration streams and stuff like that. But when you take a civilization or a bunch of civilizations or an ethnicity or a bunch of ethnicities or a race or whatever that has 6 children because 4 of them are going to die before they reach adolescence, that's a sustainable model for their mode of existence, you know. But then when you introduce food, like food aid and medicine sans frontiere and stuff like that, and people going down and giving them vaccines and making sure all 6 of the children reach adulthood, or maybe 5 out of 6 reach adulthood, then you know it doesn't take a genius to see that we're going to reach a tipping point with the population in Africa as well, and it's largely the fault of the UN and you know, big-hearted European people that were in this situation.
Yeah, as Edward Dutton would probably say, this is what you get when you pluck people out of their familiar Darwinian conditions. You get a certain type of people that are, not bred, but evolved to live in a certain habitat, and you put them right in the middle of London, and then see what the genetic and behavioral mismatch looks like.
Yeah, well, Linkola said that when he was asked about like starvation and stuff in Africa, he said, "What the best thing that you can possibly do is let nature run its course," right? Which made
It's
him
very
sound like
simple. Yeah.
a monster to people, though, right?
Yeah.
Because we have this thing in us where we have to save every last crying child, right? Even if it means the death of our entire civilization.
And what was fascinating about Linkola, and we could probably end on this because I have to get going soon, but one thing that I found fascinating was he was able to keep one foot in each room. He had these core principles that could, to different audiences, sound different sorts of extremes. So one would be that he's on record saying that we should encourage diversity as much as possible, right? And in terms of just ecology, in terms of animal systems and human systems, like how much diversity is enough diversity? And his simple answer, I believe I'm correct, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that as much as possible, as long as it does not, negatively impact anything else. Which means, from the outside, you hear that and you would say, oh, this guy's pro diversity. But also, he would say, in the case of the migrant crisis, that diversity is actually threatening the larger diversity. So you would actually have to cull one of the overpopulating systems to preserve the diversity of a smaller system. So then from that angle, you're like, oh my God, this guy's a genocidal maniac, but he just has the one
Well,
principle.
well, the thing that I like about him is he really was outspoken about democracy. You know, he understood the inherent failings in it, and I just saw Dave Rubin and Sargon of Akkad saying that they were all they're suddenly discovering the problems with democracy. It's like, really, you're discovering something that the ancient Greeks figured out 2,400 years ago. Bravo. It's like, but his here's a quote from him is that democracy empowers selfishness. Any political system based on desire is fundamentally flawed. Society and life have been organized on the principle of organized on the basis of individual desires, not as what is good for nature. And the elite is needed to rule. So he was in a lot of ways. Um, he believed in an elite that's needed to rule, but only an elite with a different vision than just providing material comfort, you know, which has been our guiding principle for the last like couple hundred years, you know, is further advancement to pursue material comfort.
I agree. It's interesting how he had these really good heaters later in life about he didn't have a TV, but he had enough of awareness to say the right things to appeal to the completely online, such as myself.
It's funny, you know. It's like I wonder sometimes. Like I've heard like whispers that Greta Thunberg may be in correspondence with Ted Kaczynski, and that would be interesting. I'm not sure how old Uncle Ted's faring these days, but I would be surprised if she hadn't at least brushed up with the ideas of Pentti Linkola, even though she seems to be ardently anti-fascist.
If
I
if
don't see.
if there's a redemption arc for Greta Thunberg, I will be very interested to see that. If it turns out that she's based and awesome, I'll do a 180. I will admit fault and that I didn't see that one coming, but I hope that's what's happening.
Well, with the Extinction Rebellion kids like gluing their hands to like masterpieces and throwing soup on them and stuff like that. It was one of the last ones that they did, and it sort of suddenly dawned on me like, um, I'm not even sure if it was their intention, but they glued their hands to it and dumped something on the protective glass that was over it, and people were like, chop their goddamn hands off and this, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
really, like especially in our sphere, people were really going to town on it. But I was thinking to myself, is like the painter painted that idyllic natural scene to try and bring an awareness of the glory of nature to human beings, right? And people fetishize the object, the simulation of the natural depiction more than they would care about the actual scenery itself. So if the landscape that he painted were bought up by a gypsum mine who raised every tree and put up a god awful monstrosity of a factory with smoke building out of it, nobody would care. Nobody would protest. Nobody would probably even know. But this one depiction of it is so sacred to them that they admire the human achievement of creating this simulation more than they valued the actual tract of land itself.
Which is
It's
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, what you're saying is you would like to see them, or I would. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I would like to see them say, "Let's chop the hands off the people who want to clear cut what that painting was depicting."
Yeah, or like maybe we should recalibrate what is our objects of desire.
That's true. I think that's probably a really good place to end, as any. This has been a fantastic interview with you, and I want to
You
thank.
think so? We hardly talked about Linkola, and
Oh no, we talked.
frankly,
I think we talked about him quite more than in the past when I had people on that we stayed on topic. We actually, I'm very happy with how much we stayed on topic. Believe it or not.
really, okay, that's good then, because we did meander a lot, and I spent the last couple of days sort of like brushing up on, and then of course when the moment comes, like most of it, what I wanted to say completely flew out of my head, and it's been like that with me for every podcast, and so I don't know how to counteract that, but
No, hey, the whole point of podcasting is that at a certain point, everything flies out of your head, and you just fake it. Happens to me. How many times have I gotten to review a book and I haven't gotten to like half the notes? It happens all the time.
yeah. Well, let me end with this Jacques Cousteau quote, and if we're going to be talking about people who quip the odd based thing, and he once said, "This is a terrible thing to say." Oh, maybe I should do it in a French accent. Nah, I'll suffer. I'll save your listeners the suffering of that. This is a terrible thing to say. In order to stabilize world population, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. It's a horrible thing to say, but it's just as bad not to say it.
And again, we come back to what needs to be said. And before we go, I wonder if you had anything that you'd like to direct people to, anything that, like not to say a Substack or anything, but anything you would like to promote, perhaps.
No, I have a page on Telegram that even the people that I converse with most closely don't even follow. So,
Sons of
um,
whores.
yeah, sons of bitches. But I am. The problem with me is I'm not a very good locutor. Is that a word, locutor? I'm not a very good speaker, but I am a better writer because I'll go back over a paragraph like a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen times just to sort of try and coordinate it in such a way that it has like the most best impact and stuff. I'm a way better writer, and what I'm trying to do right now is just sort of write. Um, sort of I wanted to sort of synthesize the ideas of Arne Ness and Linkola And then when I went back over the RNS stuff, it's like I don't really give a shit about this high-minded philosophy stuff. I want to write a more practical based approach to how people um, can maybe present these ideas to people in their everyday lives. Um, try and present solutions. Like I say, like with the forestry example I gave, fisheries. There's another one. Like fisheries, the people who used to fish around here would fish for part of the year and then sit around for the rest of the year, right? They could have used that time to restoring salmon habitats, to doing like being paid to go out and do beach cleanups, harvesting plastic garbage. Like you say, we need a more holistic a way of thinking about um, uh, the way we conduct our professions. Like personally, I'm a woodworker, and I'm in the process of planting golden chain trees. We have other trees here that I'm planning to put in the ground this next spring. Actually, like difficult ones, and increasingly rare ones like Gary oak and things like that. To try and, even though my particular type of woodworking doesn't use a ton of wood, I would definitely like to repay the wood that I've taken from nature, and if we could start thinking more on that basis, like how we could repair active harm that we do through our professions. Um, yeah, I think that would be a really good place to start with a more dissident, uh, radical ecological approach that isn't tinged by social justice and all this other modern day, garbage.
Well, let me just say, first of all, it's very admirable what you're doing, that you're actually walking the walk like that. Secondly, maybe we can talk about this later. I'm going to be launching a publication probably either next month or at the beginning of next year. And the sort of thing that you're talking about is the stuff that I'm trying to write about as well, because I've been writing a lot recently too. So we could actually talk about that if you're open to it. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, so we'll end it there. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I think we'll probably end up talking again sometime soon. Because
Eh,
sorry, continue.
yeah, anytime, man. And I just want to remind you, you're in marketing, so you've got a lot of penance to do.
How many trees do I got to plant to save my soul?
That's between you and God.
Yeah.
And Pentti, peace be upon him.
Please be upon him. All right, I'll talk to you soon, man.
All right, man.
All right,
Cheers now.
bye.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.